Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagatgurum. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to our ongoing class on Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Class number 20, the big 20. Heads up first. Okay, today we'll be discussing chapter 10, the Yoga of the Intelligent Will of Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita. Now, this chapter, this is characteristic of Sri Aurobindo. He might spend an entire chapter on one verse, and another chapter he might devote to like 40 verses. So this is a case of a chapter which covers 2.39 all the way down to the end of chapter 2, 2.72. So about, 33 verses. And as I promised, what I'd like to do is not just go through the essays on the Gita chapter by chapter, but also go through the Gita itself verse by verse. What that means is, for us, practically speaking, is since the chapter we're discussing today covers 2.39 to 72, we can't possibly go through that many verses. So here's what we'll do. We'll start with 2.45 today, because we stopped with 2.44 in the last class. And we'll read as many verses as we get through. And we'll continue in the next few classes just going through the Gita verses, verse by verse. But we won't actually read anything new from Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita until we get to chapter 3, because the next chapter concerns chapter 3. Does that make sense? Okay, so now, heads up wise. What are our next classes? When are they? Here's my proposal. Our next class will be 1 week from now, but with no extra homework assignment. See? So you don't worry. You chill out. Okay. So Sunday, June 2nd, 9:30 a.m. And we're just going to continue reading through the verses from chapter 2 of the Gita, you see. And then the next Sunday as well, June 9th, 9:30 a.m. will be the second Gita class of June. There might be a little homework assignment. But again, without any new reading from Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita. I might refer to the same chapter that we'll start discussing today, the Yoga of the Intelligent Will. Do you see what I mean? I'll give an assignment based on that. And then the subsequent class would be Sunday, June 23rd at 9:30 a.m. Okay? So the next three classes, one more time. Sunday, June 2nd, 9:30 a.m. So next Sunday, but no homework assignment. Sunday, June 9th, 9:30 a.m. There probably will be a homework assignment study, but not from Essays on the Gita. And Sunday, June 23rd, 9:30 a.m. Okay? Those are the three classes in June. So, let's start on chapter 2 of the Gita, verse 45. So just to remind you of where we are in the chapter. In verse 39 of chapter 2, and you guys can use the app as usual. There's an Aurobindo app on the phone. Or you can just, if you have any kind of book, you can follow along with it. 2.39, Krishna says, I have just spoken to you about Sankhya Buddhi, the intelligence based on Sankhya. Which is what? That you are not the body-mind complex, you are the eternal soul, the eternal Atman, separate from the body-mind complex. And so you can never die as the soul. Only the body perishes, but not the eternal soul. Then he says, now I'm going to teach you Buddhi based on yoga, which means, he calls it later, Buddhi Yoga. And as Anthony points out in his study question responses, and as all of you pretty much figured out in answer to this first study question, what exactly is this yoga of the intelligent will? The Sanskrit term is Buddhi Yoga. I think Alice mentioned it too. It's Buddhi Yoga. It's the yoga of the Buddhi, and specifically referring to Karma Yoga. It's a synonym for Karma Yoga. So the yoga of the intelligent will is a synonym for Karma Yoga. So Krishna says in verse 39, I've just explained to you Sankhya Buddhi, using your intelligence to discriminate between what you are and what you aren't. You are not this physical body, you are not even the mind, you are the eternal Atman, separate from the body-mind complex. Okay, there's some kind of noise here.
It's from the backpack itself.
I think it's coming from your backpack.
It sounds like it's coming from the backpack itself.
After I came in through the door, and I didn't know what
Are you sure? It does sound like it's
No,
something.
It's on you.
Yeah, it's something on your back.
Yeah.
It's on you. Your phone is playing like.
Oh,
Oh.
I'm sorry.
It's like, no, it's not me. Can't be. You're all wrong. Okay. So, okay. So, today the theme of the class is Karma Yoga. And it'll be very practical. You'll see as spiritual aspirants, all of us are concerned with what exactly is Karma Yoga? How can we be Karma Yogis? What are the dangers or challenges involved when we're trying to practice Karma Yoga? So that's also, you got the sense, I hope, that from the study questions that was a thrust of the question, of a number of the questions. So now in that context, then, so that was 2.39. And then last week we discussed the subsequent verses. 2.41 talks about two kinds of buddhi. Vyavasayatmaka, there's a one-pointed buddhi, a one-pointed intelligence, which is fixed on a certain spiritual goal. And then there's the bahushaka kind of buddhi, the many-branching buddhi, the multifarious buddhi going in 100 directions based on the desires of the ego. Then verses 42 to 44 go on the attack, the offensive, and Krishna suddenly goes into this mode of criticizing Vedic fundamentalism. Right? The karma kanda portion of the Vedas, the ritualistic portion of the Vedas, which say do X, Y, and Z as per these instructions, and you will go to heaven and enjoy life there, and then come back here and enjoy life here, and then it goes on like that. Okay, now we get to 2.45. That's the context. Keep it in mind, because that's important. So let's now look at the app, 2.45. The app, by the way, for those of you who are new, you can get it on the App Store if you type in Gītā Aurobindo, and the developer's name is Vande Mataram. Okay, so please repeat after me. Traigunya Vishaya Veda
Traigunya Vishaya Veda
Nistraigunyo
Nistraigunyo
Bhavarjuna
Bhavarjuna
Nidvandvo
Nidvandvo
Nityasattvastho
Nityasatvasto
Niryogakshema
Niryogakshema
Atmavan.
Atmavan.
Okay, Anvaya. So this is a rearrangement of the words to make the verse's meaning clearer, more comprehensible. Hey Arjuna, O Arjuna, Vedaha Traigunya Vishayaha. The Vedas concern what? The three gunas. What are the three gunas? Anyone? Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, exactly. But now it gets a little tricky, this verse. Nistraigunyaha. Okay. Nidvandvaha, Nityasatvastaha, Niryogakshemaha, Atmavan, Bhava. Bhava at the end means be. It's an imperative. Be, do, like it means be. Be what? Nistraigunyaha. Go beyond all three of the gunas. That's what Nistraigunya means. Nidvandvaha. Go beyond the dvandvas, the dualities. Pleasure, pain, happiness, sadness, hot, cold, etc. Nityasatvastaha. Here's where Krishna throws a wrench into the whole thing. Nityasatvastaha, or at least makes the verse a little bit more puzzling on the surface. Nityasatvastaha means ever remaining rooted in sattva, literally. What's the problem here?
Because we just went beyond them.
Very good, exactly. That's the apparent contradiction. Krishna is telling Arjuna on the one hand, go beyond the three gunas, and then in the same breath, be sattvic. Sattva is one of the three gunas. How can you be beyond the three gunas and sattvic at the same time? This is the puzzle for the commentators. Okay, and niryogakshemaha. Niryogakshema means, yoga means acquiring things that you don't already have. Kshema means preserving the things which you already have. Worldly people are all about yoga and kshema, right? I want this, I want that, which you don't have. And once you get that Lamborghini that you've worked so hard to, for 20 years to make enough money for, then you're worried about, oh my goodness, what if somebody puts a scratch on it? Or that's kshema. That's preserving what you already have. Okay. So niryoga kshema. Be free from, I want this, I want that, and be free from, I need to maintain X, Y, and Z, and I have to wax my eyebrows and this and that. Okay. All right. That's also kshema. Okay. Atmavan. Atmavan means literally possessed of the self, but what does that really mean? It just means being firmly rooted in your true nature as the Atman, separate from the body-mind complex. We're all souls. We're not bodies. We're souls inhabiting bodies, right? Okay. So now, how do commentators deal with this prima facie contradiction between Krishna telling Arjuna to be beyond the three gunas, to go beyond the three gunas, and at the same time to be rooted in sattva? Well, they have to gloss one of the two terms differently. So either the nistraigunyaha, which means go beyond the three gunas, they have to interpret as not exactly three gunas, but in some other sense, or they interpret the ever remaining firmly rooted in sattva. They interpret the sattva not quite as sattva guna, but as something else. So these are two different strategies for handling this. So let me give you a sense of how some of these commentators do it. Shankara says he takes the route of interpreting the nistraigunyaha, go beyond the three gunas. That's not he doesn't take it literally, and he says what Krishna is telling Arjuna to do is to be nishkama. Nishkama. Okay, so Shankara, this is now, we're talking about verse 2.45. And the question, so, nistraigunyaha. Nistrai. Okay, Shankara says, this means be nishkama. Which means what? Desireless. And the contradiction comes from the fact that a little bit later in the same verse, Krishna tells Arjuna to be nitya sattvastha. And sattva is the third guna, right? Okay. So, Shankara says, yeah. Krishna is not telling Arjuna to go beyond all three gunas. He's telling him to be desireless by engaging in karma yoga. You have to keep the context in mind here. Shankara does not believe that karma yoga is the highest spiritual practice. Only jnana yoga is, the path of knowledge. Okay. So in the context of Krishna instructing Arjuna, he is addressing Arjuna as an inferior spiritual aspirant who has an impure mind, who is only qualified to practice karma yoga. In that context, what Krishna is telling Arjuna is, your priority is to become as sattvic as possible. You're not at the stage yet where you have to worry about going beyond the three gunas. That's the jnana yoga level adhikaris. Those are the people who are fit for jnana yoga, not for you. You see? So in that context, Shankara is saying it's more reasonable to take this nistraigunyaha as not literally meaning going beyond the three gunas, but as be free from desires as you engage in karma yoga. What kind of desires? Desire for the fruits of the work. Well, we're about to get to that with one of the most famous verses, 2.47. We'll talk about that. One of the study questions was about that. Okay? And then Shankara is able to take nitya sattvastha literally. Krishna is telling Arjuna, be as sattvic as possible. Be ever rooted in sattva. Sri Aurobindo takes a different route. He takes nistraigunyaha literally as going beyond the three gunas. But he takes nitya sattvastha, he takes sattva here not to mean sattva guna, but his rendering is ever based in the true being. So he takes the sattva here in the sense of true being rather than as the third guna. So that's his way of handling the contradiction. I don't think there's any obvious solution to this. I don't think that's a damning problem, but there are different ways of handling it, and I don't think one is obviously right and the other is wrong. So I'm just presenting to you different options here. And Swami Tapasyananda also goes the route of creatively reinterpreting the nitya sattvastha. So Tapasyananda takes this at face value, along with Sri Aurobindo, and says, yeah, go beyond the three gunas. But how do you interpret the sattva here? He says, you should be ever steady in purity. So Tapasyananda takes sattva here to mean purity and not sattva guna in the literal sense. Okay, so they're just, you can see how commentators do their creative work here. But how is this relevant for us as spiritual aspirants? This is something I emphasize a lot in my classes and my talks, because I think it's really important. A lot of us as spiritual aspirants, we like to skip steps, whether that's by taking ayahuasca or but another way they like to skip steps is to think that we're already eligible to practice the most rigorous and highest spiritual disciplines, like the path of knowledge is very popular these days. Neo-Advaitins, so-called Neo-Advaitins, they love that and say, I'm already beyond the three gunas, I'm not bound. And it's great in a way, but you have to be very careful because it's easy to deceive yourself. In my opinion, the first priority in spiritual life, the ultimate aim in spiritual life is what? Self-realization, God realization, whatever you want to call it, right? That's great. That is the ultimate ideal. But that's too high an ideal for it to be practicable on a daily basis. What's the most practicable, proximate goal that we should set for ourselves as spiritual aspirants? Becoming as sattvic as possible. It's absolutely crucial. Nitya sattvasta. So I think it's actually useful for us to take this literally. Be as sattvic as possible. So I'm with Shankara on this. And one of those rare occasions when I when I agree with Shankara. Because it really is very practical and very helpful in our spiritual life. How can we make every moment of our life as sattvic as possible? This is the best way to be spiritual for the vast majority of us. Talking about going beyond the three gunas is such a high-level thing. The way that Sri Ramakrishna used to put it is, remember the robbers? Did we talk about this last time? I talk about it all the time. Yeah, so you all know the robbers. But the point is, the sattva guna, the third robber, who helps that poor gentleman, points him in the right direction, and then the gentleman says, why don't you come with me? He says, where you're going, I can't follow. But the point is, it's first becomes sattvic, and then, as Sri Ramakrishna used to say, the mind itself becomes the guru. Then, so just the priority is become sattvic, and then sattva will point you in the right direction. So you don't need to worry about. Don't worry now about going beyond the three gunas. Okay? All right. So that's the practical takeaway, I hope, from this verse. Now let's look at 2.46. Our second study question is about this very verse. So let's look at it carefully. Please repeat after me. Yāvān artha udapani sarvatah samplutodake tāvān sarveshu vedeshu brahmanasya vijanatah. Sorry, I broke the chanting style. I'm getting confused now. I have to do the morning chanting too, and I'm getting all these different chanting styles confused in my head. Anyway, all right. Okay, so here's the rearrangement of the words. Sarvataha samplutodake udapane yāvān artha. Okay, artha means use. As much value or use there is in a well when there's a flood all around, a deluge. In India, there frequently floods because of monsoon season. Just like that, how much use is there in a well when there's water all over the place? Vijanataha. Here the word is interesting, vijanataha, because the same word, literally in the same form of the verb, is used in the Isha Upanishad. Vijanataha. Tatra ko moha kashoka ekatvam arupashyataha. Anyway, right before that one. So anyway, vijanataha comes from the word jnana, but adding v before it. So vijnana, you see where I'm going with this. And this is just the form which means knowing perfectly, or knowing comprehensively. Vijanataha comes vijnana. It's the same word, but just in a different verbal form. So, to the vijanataha brahmanasya, to the person who, the vijnani, who is a knower of Brahman, sarveshu vedeshu tāvān. Just like that, just as a well is not of much use to one when there's a flood all around, just so, to the knower of Brahman, to the Vijnani, what? All the Vedas, sarveshu vedeshu, are just as useful or useless, whatever you want to see it. Not that they're useless, but you've already got what you're looking for. Okay. Here again, there's an interesting interpretive controversy. It has to do with how we interpret sarveshu vedeshu. What exactly does Veda mean here? All the Vedas, literally. So there are two routes we can take. And part of the reason why I asked, the study question number 2 asks, compare Swami Tapasyananda's interpretation with Sri Aurobindo's, is because they take different routes in interpreting the Vedas here. What is meant by Vedas here? Tapasyananda takes the route of saying what the Vedas means is the Karma Kanda portion of the Vedas, the ritualistic portion of the Vedas, Vedic fundamentalism. The portion that teaches perform sacrifices in order to go to heaven and enjoy in heaven and come back and this and that. As opposed to what? The Jnanakanda, the knowledge portion of the Vedas, comprising the Upanishads, exactly. So Tapasyananda says, here Vedas does not include the Upanishads. Sri Aurobindo says, by contrast, it includes the Upanishads. It's all Vedas, both Karmakanda plus Jnanakanda. And the question was, which one do you find more plausible and why? And I actually don't think there's an easy answer to this question, to be honest. Part of the reason is I just gave you the context of the preceding verses, right? Now look, if you remember from verse 42, there's a phrase in the first word of the second line of 2.42 is Veda Vadarataha. Those who are obsessed with the Vedas. Veda Vada means with the literal meaning of the Vedas. The word Veda is coming up again and again just in the preceding verses. It comes up in literally the previous verse, 2.45, which you just read. Traigunya Vishaya Veda. The Vedas concern the three gunas. And here many commentators think that has to be referring to the Karma Kanda alone, the ritualistic portion, and not the Upanishads. The Upanishads don't concern primarily the three gunas. It's encouraging us to go beyond the three gunas. So in that context, I think Swami Tapasyananda makes a good case that it's reasonable if Vedas in 2.45 and in 2.42 in the preceding verses means just the Karma Kanda, the ritualistic portion of the Vedas, why shouldn't we take it to mean the ritualistic portion of the Vedas here in verse 2.46? You asked, Anthony, in your question, you wanted elaboration on this, so it's part of the reason I'm doing this. But Sri Aurobindo has a different take on this. He's linking this to the subsequent verses, and especially to verses which we're going to get to either today or next time, 2.52 and 2.53. Okay. He's looking forward rather than backward. And he's saying, no, we should take Vedas literally to mean all of the Vedas, which includes the Jnanakanda. Even the Upanishads are included. And he is reading it more in the light of Sri Ramakrishna, as I think he always does, or almost always does. That's arguable. In fact, Gītā Stevens, I'll just mention a plug for one of my faithful online participants. One of her, she's always arguing with Sri Aurobindo, thinking that he's not Ramakrishnan enough. So, but here I think he's taking more of the Ramakrishnan position on this. Because what does Sri Ramakrishna say? He uses the analogy of somebody who, let's say you need to go grocery shopping. You draw up a list of ingredients to get, or whatever, the items to get from Whole Foods, if you're fancy. Okay. So I lose that list of 10 items I need. I look all over the house because I don't remember what I need, right? I finally found it. It's tucked under some whatever. I get it. And then I look, okay, I need X, Y, Z, these ones. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, once you know what you need, you can throw away the list again. You don't need it. Just so. Once you've realized God, you don't need the scriptures anymore. The scriptures are a means to the end of God realization. And one of the things that Swami Vivekananda says about the Vedic scriptures, which is wonderful, he says, our scriptures, the Hindu scriptures alone, say that they themselves are only a means to the end and that the scriptures themselves need to be transcended. Veda Aveda, this is straight from one of the oldest Upanishads, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, says, when you've attained realization, the Vedas become Aveda. Aveda means non-Vedas. What are the Vedas when you've realized God? So Sri Aurobindo, I think, interprets this 2.46 more in the Ramakrishna spirit as the whole purpose of the scriptures is God realization or self-realization. Once you've realized God, once you've realized the self, no need for the scriptures. That's the flood all around, is God realization. The well is the scriptures. You don't need them anymore. That doesn't mean you're not grateful to them and that you don't revere them. Of course you do, because they're the means to the end. You have to revere them as the means, right? Okay. Let's look at the next verse. Well, and so let me just conclude by saying which one is correct. I don't know. We'll look at, when we get to verses 2.52 to 53, that might help you decide better whether you want to take Sarveshu Vedeshu, the Vedas, in 2.46 to mean all of the Vedas, including the Upanishads, or just the Karma Kanda, the ritualistic portion. Because 52 and 53 talk about, again, Shruti. Shruti. Instead of Vedas, Shruti. And Shruti means the Vedas. Shruti Vipratipanna means the intelligence which is bewildered by the Shruti. That's one of the main interpretations of this. And again, Sri Aurobindo will say, look, consistently, the Gita is saying you need to go beyond the Vedas as such, including the Upanishads. So that's his interpretation. But there are others as well. So just keep that in mind. I don't want to be dogmatic. I want you to think about it for yourself. Verse 47. Karmanyevadhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana ma karma phala heturbhur ma te sango stvakarmani karmani eva. This is one of the most famous verses in the entire Gita. My dad told me that when he was in 7th grade in India, you go through Sanskrit class. Maybe you also did Sanskrit class when you were in middle school or whatever. And they don't teach grammar at that level, but they make you memorize verses. And so this is one of the standard verses that they ask you to memorize. So all these little kids in India can, or many of them can recite this from memory. Karmani eva te adhikaraha ma kadachana phaleshu. It's a very interesting verse actually, because the word adhikara is used. Adhikaraha. Your adhikara, your right, is to what? Karmani eva, to the work. And not to ma kadachana, never to the phaleshu, the fruits of the karma. You have the right to the work, but not to the fruits of the work. That's the first line. Then, karma phala hetuhu ma bhuhu. Don't engage in action with the motive of acquiring the karma phala, the fruits of your actions. Don't say, I want to do X or Y to get the fruits of X or Y. Mate akarmani sangaha astu. At the same time, Krishna knows that this is what's called these days spiritual bypassing, giving a spiritual justification for your own very worldly failings, like laziness, for instance. And so he says, so in the name of spirituality and karma yoga, don't be lazy, don't be a lazy bum. He says, mate akarmani sangaha astu. Don't become attached to akarma, to not doing anything. See, if karma yoga is so hard, then let me just sleep a little more instead of doing anything. So Krishna says, no, that's also a mistake. You have to act, but act in a different spirit with a different motive. Okay. Now, what's the tricky part here about this verse? I'm a little surprised, to be honest. I didn't realize this question was going to be tricky for some of you, but I think it was. And let me repeat to you study question number 3. In the famous verse 2.47, Lord Krishna advises Arjuna to do his duty, but not to let the fruits of his actions be his motive. A common objection to this verse is that if we're not motivated by the fruits of our actions, we would... Can you shut the door, please? We would either not engage in actions at all, or we would only act half-heartedly, or strive for mediocrity at best in our work. How would you respond to this objection? Do you think this objection has any validity? If so, why? If not, why not? Sorry, it's not this one that I was... So you guys had a very thoughtful responses to this one. It's study question 4, which also concerns 2.47, where I asked you to compare Shankara's interpretation of 2.47 with Sri Aurobindo's. That's where some of you got a little bit tripped up or were a little confused by what I was looking for. But we'll get to that in a second. Or actually, let's talk about that first. I'm going to put study question 4 first, and then we'll get to study question 3. Because 3 is the more practical question for spiritual aspirants, but let me get to the technical philosophical issue first. You know I love my philosophy. Okay. Parimal, a new online participant. He's from Maharashtra. He's just joined us, so happy he made some nice contributions. So let me read to you his answer to question number 4, which is compare Shankara's and Sri Aurobindo's interpretations of 2.47 of the Gita. Which, if either, do you find more plausible and why? Parimal says, Shankara wants to say that Arjuna is an inferior aspirant. And for inferior aspirants, he has a right to karma yoga alone and not to jnana yoga. So here he makes a distinction between higher and lower aspirants, but the Gita does not clearly make such a distinction. And then he says, it is very interesting to know that though Shankara considered Arjuna to be an inferior aspirant, Madhvacharya of the dualistic school, Dvaita Vedanta, considered Arjuna to be emphasized in his Gita Bhashya that Arjuna is a superior spiritual aspirant as opposed to Shankara's interpretation. That's an interesting thing. He's pointing at Madhva's commentary, which I didn't assign, but Madhva's turning the tables on Shankara and saying, no, Shankara, Arjuna is the highest spiritual aspirant. Okay, and now Parimal says, according to Sri Aurobindo, there's no higher and lower distinction, and the whole range of human action is divine. Okay, so this is what I was looking for. I wanted you guys to catch that Shankara has a field day, especially with the term adhikara, in that first line. Karmani eva adhikaraha te. You have the adhikara, you have the right to karma, but not to the fruits. Shankara says, this is the great doctrine of adhikari bheda. Adhikari bheda. See, this is absolutely crucial to classical Advaita Vedanta. Adhikari bheda. Bheda means difference. Adhikari means competency. Spiritual competence or spiritual eligibility. So what Shankara says is, Manda adhikaris, inferior spiritual aspirants, alone are qualified to practice karma yoga and bhakti yoga, like Arjuna. And superior spiritual aspirants are qualified for jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. And he's saying this in this verse, 2.47, Krishna is clearly saying that Arjuna is an inferior spiritual aspirant. He's telling him, you have the right only to karma yoga because you have an impure mind. He's adding that. It's not there. And Parimal is saying, well, it's not clear that he's saying that Arjuna is a lower aspirant. Right? The other alternative, which is the way that Sri Aurobindo interprets it and other commentators, is taking this verse to apply to everybody across the board. The verse is not addressing only inferior spiritual aspirants, but saying to anybody, you have the right to the work, the karma, but not to the fruits of the work. And that anybody and everyone can and should practice karma yoga as a means to the goal of the realization of the divine and the realization of the self. So these are the two competing interpretations. That's what I was hoping that you guys would catch. Because Shankara, in the very beginning of his commentary, he says, Te, your, adhikaraha, right, is karmani eva, for action alone, not for steadfastness in knowledge. Oh, I can see what the problem is. The problem is he contextualizes this verse right before his commentary begins. So let's read the paragraph right before, the paragraph introducing 2.47 is where he flags this. Shankara says, therefore, before one attains the fitness for steadfastness in knowledge, jnana, rights and duties, even though they have limited utility as that of a well, pond, etc., have to be undertaken by one who is fit for rights and duties. And then begins 2.47 in Shankara's commentary. So I guess it was a trick question by accident, because I expected you to read the introductory paragraph to 2.47, of which I think some of you missed. So Shankara is saying, here's how we should understand 2.47. Arjuna is an inferior spiritual aspirant, therefore he has the right only to karma yoga, to engage in karma yoga. Okay? So that's the philosophical issue, and that's where Sri Aurobindo and Shankara really disagree. But now let's go to study question number 3, which is in many ways more relevant to us as spiritual aspirants. So this is the objection. The objection is, well, let's try to be karma yogis in our day-to-day activities. And let's try not to desire the fruits of our actions. I've heard this from many spiritual aspirants. I've heard it from many students. I'm a Hindu chaplain at USC and UCLA. I've heard it from many people. Some scholars also talk about how difficult this is. What does it mean? Is it even coherent to engage in actions if you don't desire the fruits of your actions? And a couple of you do mull over this. Ellis is one of them. Shubho, one of the online participants, also has a very interesting and thoughtful response. Shubho says, the answer to the question might be, it depends. Setting aside the spiritual aspect and considering it purely from the perspective of a worldly person, if the outcome of the action is disregarded, we face the question, does this mean one should not think of the goal at all? Or is it about maintaining equanimity whether facing success or failure? If fruit of action is taken literally and we say forget the end result, just enjoy the process, it might not resonate with the worldly person. And he goes on. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Let's be very concrete here. Okay, let's take an example. Let's imagine that we're surgeons. And we want to do this really important surgery that's coming up. This is going to be a life-saving surgery. Either in an ordinary worldly way or as karma yoga. Let's paint these two scenarios. First, I'm the worldly surgeon, which means what? I want the fruits of my actions. What are those fruits, concretely, in this case? What are the fruits of performing this life-saving surgery?
The patient survives.
Very good. First of all, yes, the patient survives. The surgery is successful is another way of putting it. How about other things? Maybe, yeah, go ahead.
I think recognition.
Yeah, exactly. Getting name and fame, recognition from your coworkers, your colleagues. Maybe you get that promotion you've been looking for, gunning for. Maybe the patient you're working on is a celebrity, and your name is going to be emblazoned in all the newspapers. Whatever it is. Okay, those are all fruits, right? That's plausible. But one of the difficulties that some people have is, well, does that mean that when I perform the surgery, I don't want to aim to help the patient or to save the patient? What do you think about that? If somebody says, so does that mean we shouldn't try to save the patient? What's your answer?
No.
I think that.
What? Anthony, what's your take on it?
My take on it is you do things for many different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Lower reasons and higher reasons.
Yeah.
If you're working on something you want to save the patient, if you have in mind the possibility that you could get something out of it, that's fine, but you need to detach yourself
Mm-hmm.
from the outcome. You need to understand that you just have to do your job.
Right.
And then the rest of it can come from it, but don't let it motivate you. Don't expect anything from it. Don't expect those things. And ultimately go beyond any form of expectation, but that takes
Okay.
a long time.
Okay.
My take on it.
Okay, but so are you saying that when a surgeon as a karma yogi performs a surgery, he should not try to save the patient?
No, of course, that's the job. That's the
That
duty.
is okay.
That's the duty.
Good. I like that. I think I think he's on the right track here. I think that's a helpful way to think about it. The aim of actually saving the patient, that's built into the work itself. That's not actually one of the fruits. But whether you succeed or fail in performing that surgery well, and whether you save the patient, is not in your hands. That's up to God. That would fall under fruits. Success or failure in achieving your aim. So the aim is built into the work itself. The aim of the work is built into the work itself. But whether you succeed in fulfilling your aim or not falls under the fruits of the work, which you should not be coveting. That's how I understand.
Right.
And I think that's a good way of thinking about it. This is really important to understand. This is a kind of a subtle distinction, but it's really, really important. It becomes, I think, arguably incoherent not to have an aim, to be aimless when you're engaging. That's not what Krishna is saying. Be aimless when you're working. No, that gets really weird. Unless you have an aim, it doesn't make any sense to engage in action in the first place. Every time you do something, you do it for a reason. You walk into a coffee shop to order coffee. If you go into a coffee shop without knowing, you're gonna, you're either crazy or enlightened. Or both. Right? So the aim is built into the work itself, but whether you succeed or fail in fulfilling your aim, in realizing your aim, that falls under the fruits, which you should not be coveting. Is that clear? Now, you might think, well, maybe that's my own speculation and whatever. I would argue that it comes in the very next verse, very explicitly. So let's look at the next verse, because I think it helps to illuminate 2.47. So 2.48. Yogasthaha kuru karmani
Gurukarmani
sangam tyaktva
Sangam Tyaktva
dhananjaya
Dhananjaya
siddhya siddhyoh
Siddhya Siddhyoh
samo bhutva
Samo Bhutva
samatvam
Samatvam
yoga uchyate.
Yoga Uchyate.
Okay. Here again, Shankara says something interesting with which I more or less agree, which is interesting. I strongly disagree with him taking 2.47 to be addressing only inferior spiritual aspirants and thinking Arjuna is an inferior spiritual aspirant. But Shankara says something really interesting. He says, in 2.47, Krishna is saying, "Oh Arjuna, don't make the fruits of your actions your motive for engaging in action." But then Shankara says, but that leaves open a very important question. What should our motive be when we act in this world? And he says 2.48 gives the answer. It's very interesting. So Shankara says, let's look at 2.48 and see what answer Krishna gives here as giving us what is the right motive behind our actions. So, He Dhananjaya, O Arjuna, Sangam Tyaktva, having renounced all attachments. Attachments to what? To the work itself and to the fruits of the work. And both things are important. You might not be attached to the fruits of the work, but you might be attached to the work. You're a workaholic. if you're given vacation for a day, you start panicking and you don't know what to do with yourself. That's not good either. So you have to be careful about getting attached to two things: the work itself and to the fruits of the work. So I take it that it includes both. Sangam tyktva. Siddhi asiddhyo samaha bhutva. Here's the key phrase in relation to 2.47. You should be samaha, equal, unperturbed. You should treat as the same. What? Siddhi and asiddhi, success and failure. Remember, I'm putting success and failure into the fruits of the work, whereas the aim of the work is built into the work itself. My aim as a surgeon is to perform the surgery to the best of my ability, which means saving the patient. Because if I mess up the surgery, this patient's going to die. That's the fact. The fruit of the work is whether I succeed or fail. Here, I think the standard, the wonderful idiom that they have in India is very useful. Do your best, leave the rest. Leave the rest to God. I'm going to do my best. That's a very important part of the work itself. Don't do anything half-heartedly in a mediocre way. That's the answer to this objection, right? Because that's not doing your duty to the best of your ability. Especially if your duty is, according to Shankara, now Shankara does something very interesting in his interpretation of 2.48. He reads bhakti into the verse where bhakti is not explicit. Because you think of Arjuna, who's qualified for bhakti yoga and karma yoga, and he says, what Krishna is saying is, your motive, O Arjuna, when you engage in action, should not be desiring the fruits of your work, success, failure, recognition, blah, blah, blah. But what should your motive be? Serving me. That's not explicit here. Nowhere in this verse does Krishna talk about serving God. It comes up very explicitly shortly thereafter in chapter 3, Mayi sarvani karmani sanyas, and in many other places. Chapter 9, Yat karoshi yadash, whatever you do, tat kurushva madharpanam, do it for me, as an offering to me, as a worship of me, as service to me. That becomes one of the keynotes of the Gita, but it's not yet a theme in the Gita. What Shankara does is he reads the later bhakti elements into this verse, and he says that your motive for acting should not be desiring the fruits of your actions, but should be to serve me and to worship me.
But 248 says fixed in yoga, fixed in the one. Isn't that bhakti?
It's a good question. So what does it mean to stand firm in yoga here? What is that yoga? Yoga is a term that can mean many things in different contexts. And so it gets tricky. There's Sankhya yoga, there's Jnana yoga, there's Dhyana yoga, there's Karma yoga, there are a million yogas. I think the context suggests Karma yoga, the yoga of the intelligent will, Buddhi yoga. Especially because in the very next verse, the word Buddhi yoga is used, which is a synonym for Karma yoga. And it's also Samatvam yoga uchate. Krishna helpfully defines yoga in the same verse, in the last quarter of 2.48. Samatvam yoga. Let me finish the anvaya, so I'm not confusing all you guys. So yogastaha karmani kuru. Engage in actions yogastaha, standing firmly rooted in yoga. And then Anthony asks a very good question. What exactly is yoga here? Krishna says, fortunately, here's what I mean by yoga. Samatvam yoga uchate. Yoga means samatva, equality. Equality in what? He's just told us. Siddhi asiddhi samaha bhutva. Being equal in success and failure. So I think yoga really does mean Buddhi yoga, aka Karma yoga, specifically defining it as be unperturbed, be equal in the midst of success or failure. So if I'm a karma yogi and I'm performing the surgery, I'm going to perform the surgery to the best of my ability as a service to God, as a worship of God, trying to see God in the patient himself or herself. Whether I succeed or fail in the surgery, not up to me. That's why Sri Aurobindo would say, God laughs twice. Once when two brothers are quarreling over a piece of land, saying, this land is mine, and the other brother, no, this land is mine, and God laughs, because he says, all that land is neither of theirs, all the land is mine. Second time God laughs, when a doctor tells a mother, very confidently, I will save your son, don't worry, nothing to worry about. God laughs. Your son's about to die, oh mother, and this doctor is arrogantly telling you he's going to save his life? Life and death is in my hands, it's not in the hands of any human doctor. Same thing. So this is a case of success or failure falls under the fruits. We should not desire success or failure. That doesn't mean we should do the work in a half-hearted manner. We should do it fully as a service to God. Because when we serve God, just as parents who love their children, when they do something for their children, they'll do it to the best of their ability. They're not going to do it in a half-hearted way. That's why in Hinduism we consider God our mother, divine father, whatever, however. So when you're serving God, when you're doing something for God, every day we have a nitya puja, a daily puja, and we have a food offering. And when devotees, when the people here cook food for God, we do it with utmost attention and care and love. Why? Because we're doing it for God, for Sri Ramakrishna. We should do every action in that spirit. And yet at the same time, this is also true. This is a funny thing about Hollywood. This is like one of those, it's like a koan almost. Prepare food for Sri Ramakrishna really well, and yet you're not allowed to taste the food while you're cooking. You can't, this is a cook. One of the staples when you're cooking, you have to taste it to see whether there's enough salt, whether, so this is one of those very difficult things where we're requiring people when they cook for Sri Ramakrishna to cook really well, make it delicious for Sri Ramakrishna, and yet you're not allowed to taste the food because tasting it makes it uchishta. It defiles the food. It can't be offered anymore to Sri Ramakrishna. And so many devotees, with full of love in their hearts, try to cook food for Sri Ramakrishna, but they can't taste it, and then afterward they eat it themselves, like, oh no, I offered this to Sri Ramakrishna. So anyway, it's tricky. So, but see, there's a good practical example of, you do your best. They're no doubt doing their best, but they don't always succeed. And that's not their fault. It's because we're almost giving them an impossible task. Can't blame them. Okay, so success and failure are the fruits of the work. Don't covet them. That's the basic lesson. So now let's look at 2.49. So 2.47, 2.48, 2.49 are all of a piece. It's all, Krishna is explaining karma yoga here. Okay. Durena hyavaram karma buddhi yogat dhananjaya buddhau sharanam anvichya kripanaha phalahetavaha. O Dhananjaya, O Arjuna, buddhi yogat karma durena avaram. Karma is far inferior to buddhi yoga. Karma, which means just action, plain old action, is far inferior to buddhi yoga. What does buddhi yoga mean? I've already told you. Karma yoga. Karma is far inferior to karma yoga. That's what he means. Buddhau sharanam anvichya. Take refuge in buddhi. Phalam hetavaha kripanaha. Phala hetavaha kripanaha. Those people are pitiable. We should have pity. We should feel sad for those people who are what? Phala hetavaha. Whose motives for actions are the phala, the karma phala. The fruits in the form of success, failure, recognition. Why? Why are they so pitiable? Anyone? Why should we pity these people and ourselves?
They don't control the results.
Yeah, it's not in their hands, which means that what? They're in for some unhappy times if they're always, yes.
All you're saying is like it's miserable when things don't happen.
Yeah, it means your happiness, your well-being depends on the outcome of actions, the outcomes of which are beyond your control. You can't control those things. You can control whether you do something to the best of your ability. So doing it half-heartedly, within your control. So there you should try your best. As I said, do your best, leave the rest. Not do your half-best. Do your best. But leave the rest means you don't have control over the outcome. And if you're obsessed with the outcome, and I need to succeed, it's a recipe for unhappiness. Right? That's why I say, I sometimes give lectures on positive psychology in relation to Vedanta, the science of happiness, Bhagavad Gita and positive psychology. And there's a book written by Martin Seligman called Authentic Happiness, where Martin Seligman says the key to the good life, instead of just chasing after different forms of instant gratification, you should do two things. Number one, identify your signature strengths. What are your unique strengths and your weaknesses? But especially your strengths. Secondly, find a vocation, a calling, a line of work that helps you to cultivate those signature strengths on a daily basis. And this has become huge in positive psychology. And I think he's really onto something. Gītā talks about that. Except, I say, Gītā adds a third step, which is missing, I think, from all of Western positive psychology. Analyze the motives behind the action. Even if you identify your signature strengths correctly, even if you find a vocation which helps you to cultivate those signature strengths on a daily basis, you find what you love. Even then, what's the spirit in which you are engaging in your calling, your vocation? Are you doing it selfishly? Is there a lot of ego involved? Are you constantly hankering after the fruits of your actions? Are you looking for name and fame and success? Then you're still not going to have a very fulfilling life. So there needs to be a step 3, which Vedanta adds, which the Gita adds, which is mentioned in 2.47, 48, 49, which is analyze the motives behind your actions. And it's not so easy. It's one thing to talk about it and lecture about karma yoga. It's a much more difficult thing to actually practice it. Sri Ramakrishna says, it's all well and good to talk about karma yoga, but it's so difficult to know when that ego will subtly creep into that work. So you have to always be on your guard. You have to always be exercising vichara, discrimination. You have to be like a sentry guard, watching over yourself and checking. There are gross forms of ego where it's obvious. Like, some people, it's very obvious. They've donated $1 billion and they say, on the condition that I get a giant plaque saying, donated by Elon Musk, or whatever it is. But it doesn't have to be that gross. There can be subtle forms of ego, where it still creeps in. Where it's just a slight difference in tone. Sri Ramakrishna one day, he's walking, and there's a guy who's well known to him, who he sees him every day, this Brahmin priest or somebody, and just literally from the tone of that person's voice and the way that he greeted Sri Ramakrishna that day, he said, "Hey Brahmin, hello Brahmin." He's referring to Sri Ramakrishna. "Hey dude, what's up?" This kind of. Sri Ramakrishna said, this guy's come into money. Just from the slight change in the tone of voice. There's a little cockiness to it. There's a little bit of arrogance behind it. It's like, I'm all that, yeah, So that's a subtle form of ego. That's also dangerous. So we have to be very careful when we engage in karma yoga, not just to watch out for the gross forms of ego. That's easier to catch. But the subtle forms of ego. Okay. Okay, we only have 8 minutes left. What I was thinking of doing is... let me address some questions. Let me do that. And then, because in the next few classes we'll be going through the verses. So, let's see here. Now, questions-wise, did we cover all the study questions? I hope we did, right? Yeah, okay, good. Okay. Anthony, I've already hopefully discussed 2.46 for you. Buddy Mal asked a question about Buddhism. Is Gita pre-Buddhistic or post-Buddhistic? Sri Aurobindo himself says that many of the Mahayana Buddhistic ideas are actually influenced by the Gita. See the footnote of Essays on the Gita, chapter 9, page 86. Let me read you the footnote. Sri Aurobindo says, at the same time, the Gita seems to have largely influenced Mahayanist Buddhism, and texts are taken bodily from it into the Buddhist scriptures. This is what this questioner has in mind. The questioner is Parimal, our new Maharashtrian participant online. Then he says, if this be so, it makes Gita pre-Buddhistic text. But in the last class, you mentioned the Gita to be a post-Buddhistic text. So this is a good question. Let me clarify. Buddha precedes Mahayana Buddhism. Buddha, meaning the person, Buddha, Gautama Buddha. He preceded the Gita because he was before the Common Era. And the Gita most likely is, we don't know exactly, but probably 200, 300 CE of the Common Era. So it's post-Buddhistic in the sense of being post-Buddha. Mahayana Buddhism comes up after Buddha's time, obviously, a few centuries after the Buddha. And what Sri Aurobindo is saying is that the major Mahayana Buddhists, Nagarjuna and others, I don't know, he doesn't say Nagarjuna, but I imagine he has these kinds of people in mind, come up in like the 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century Common Era, which are post-Gita. And what Sri Aurobindo is saying is that Mahayana Buddhist texts, which come up after the Gita, some of them seem to have been influenced by some of the Gita's concepts. That's an interesting claim. I don't know how true it is. But my claim in the earlier class was the Gita itself was influenced by Buddha's teachings. And the earliest Buddhist teachings about nirvana. Nirvana is a term that is not really known in the ancient Upanishads, for instance, but it's one of the main terms used by Buddha himself in the Tipitaka. The Tipitaka is a text that definitely predates the Bhagavad Gita. It was before the Common Era. And that's supposed to be the authoritative compendium of the Buddha's teachings. You'll find references to the anatta, the doctrine of no self, the doctrine of nirvana, that the goal of life is nirvana, the Four Noble Truths, the goal of life is nirvana, all these things. Okay, so that's, I hope that clarifies that issue.
Swami,
Yes.
Tapasyananda says that the Gita predates Buddhism because he does point out the nirvana references, but he also says nirvana in the Gita is different, and then he says there's no other reference in Buddhist philosophy.
That's interesting. Do you know the page? We can look at it. But so there are different views. And look, I mean, especially Hindus in India, they have a tendency to kind of push back the dates of these scriptures to as far back as possible. We are the oldest. We are the greatest. We predate everyone else. I'm inclined to think that the scholars are more correct on this point. So yeah, but intelligent people can disagree about it. Yeah. Let's see here. Shubho actually had a similar question about nirvana, so I've covered that. Okay, do any of you have questions in person? Yeah, Leela? Your hand is sort of halfway
I
up.
think we've kind of answered later.
Okay. So Gita Stevens has a question. Page 97 she's referring to. Why does Aurobindo say, this is from the chapter we were discussing today, the Yoga of the Intelligent Will, page 97 of my edition, the complete works. She says, why does Aurobindo say the power of will proceeds from Purusha if Purusha is actionless and changeless consciousness? Is it so different from Nirguna Brahman? Aurobindo states that, quote, the Sankhya which the Gita accepts, the contact of soul and nature, generates the play of subjectivity and objectivity, end quote. Okay, I'm going to read this because it's interesting. She's questioning whether Sri Aurobindo is Ramakrishna enough. Remember I mentioned that earlier? And then he also talks about Prakriti being, quote, reflected in the pure consciousness of Purusha. Doesn't everyone else say Purusha is reflected on Prakriti? Who gives the analogy of Purusha as the sun and Prakriti as bowls of water? Does the Gita talk like that? It seems to go against the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, saying they are not actually two different or in any way distinct entities, but two ways of looking at the same thing. Why is Aurobindo reinforcing dualism instead of clarifying the reality as more like Thakur taught? I'm having a hard time feeling that he truly reflects Thakur's teachings. He seems to agree with Thakur part of the time, like more in the previous chapter, and lapses into traditional teachings at other times. He makes it even worse when he reinforces that Prakriti is inert as if the wave can exist outside of the water. If he said this is Sankhya of the classical school, then fine, but he clearly said that the Gita accepts this that he is talking about. So this is an important concern that Gita is raising here. I think there's an easy answer, but you may not be convinced, Gita. You can decide for yourself, or all of you also. We have to take this chapter as following from the preceding chapters. So if you yourself think that he was being Ramakrishna in the previous chapter, obviously he's presupposing what he already said. What does he say, crucially, in the previous chapters? The Gita modifies the classical Sankhya doctrine in certain key ways. Number one, whereas Sankhya takes Prakriti to be strictly inert, insentient, jada, Gita posits a double Prakriti, two Prakritis, and three Purushas. triple Purusha and double Prakriti. Remember, these are the terms here. What are the two Purushas? What are the two Prakritis? Apara Prakriti and Para Prakriti. The inferior Prakriti and the supreme Prakriti. And what Sri Aurobindo is referring to here, in the context of classical Sankhya, is clearly the Apara Prakriti, the inferior Prakriti, which is insentient. And he's just bracketing out the Para Prakriti, the supreme Prakriti, which is Shakti. That's a term used by Sri Ramakrishna, which Sri Aurobindo fully accepts and thinks that the Gita fully accepts, and which comes in chapter 7 and chapter 15 as well, and the Purushottama concept and all that. Okay? And what are the three Purushas? Again, now she's asking about Purusha as well. In classical Sankhya, each of us, in our deepest essence, is a Purusha. And that Purusha is inactive, it's eternal, it's a kind of eternal soul, a kind of pure consciousness, except that there are multiple Purushas. Okay, that's the important thing. Now, what does Gita do to this? It accepts that Purusha and says, yeah, in one sense, that multiple Purusha doctrine that you guys believe in, you classical Sankhyans, corresponds to the Jiva. Each one of us is an individual Jiva, an individual soul, separate from the body-mind complex. Mame vamsho jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatana. Each jiva is a portion of me, says Krishna, is a portion of the divine. So in that sense. At the same time, there's another sense in which Krishna also accepts this Purusha doctrine of classical Sankhya, which is more like the Nirguna Brahman. It's the Akshara Brahman of chapter 15. We haven't gotten there yet. So, but Sri Aurobindo keeps alluding to it, so that's why I'm mentioning it. There are three Purushas: Kshara Purusha, Akshara Purusha, and Purushottama. That Akshara Purusha, that second undecaying Purusha, is the Nirguna Brahman of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, more or less. Each of us is non-dual pure consciousness in our deepest essence. We are also jivas, individual souls, but we're also even more deeply non-dual pure consciousness, which means there's no difference between your pure consciousness and my pure consciousness at that level of non-duality. And when we attain the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, we merge, like the salt all melting into the ocean, we merge into that Akshara Purusha. But even that is not the be-all and end-all. The be-all and end-all is the Purushottama, which is, as Sri Ramakrishna used to say, Bhagavana kono itine, you can never put a limit to God. And it's both Brahman and Shakti. Brahman, in Sri Ramakrishna's sense, corresponds to the Akshara Purusha, the Nirguna Brahman of Shankara. And Shakti is the personal God. And God is both, equally and beyond both. As Sri Ramakrishna used to say. Sri Ramakrishna would say, God is both with form, without form, and much more besides. Much else besides. Abar kotoki. Okay? All right. So, let me reiterate one more time. Next class is next Sunday, June 2nd, 9:30 a.m. Thankfully, I'm sure you're grateful that there's no homework assignment extra. The class after that, Sunday, June 9th, 9:30 a.m. There probably will be a homework assignment, so keep your eyes out for that. Watch out for that, but I'll announce that next week anyway. And then the last class in June will be Sunday, June 23rd at 9:30 a.m. All right? Okay, thanks, guys. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.